like to go through this with you and show you the importance of each one of these phases. The first, the universe, the solar system, and the planet Earth in themselves and in their evolutionary emergence constitute for the human community the primary revelation of that ultimate mystery whence all things emerge into being. So, going to this question of the revelatory aspect of the universe, but particularly in its sequence. Now, one of the things that might be said here is the way in which we tell the story of creation. When we tell the story of creation of the Bible, God says that's good and so forth. I mentioned that before. And it comes to the human, it says that's very good. Now, if we tell the story now, how do we tell it? Well, the galactic shaping took place, and God said that's good. Then we get the development of the solar system. We get the supernova explosion and the scattering of stardust and the shaping of stardust into the solar system and the shaping of planet Earth, and God says that's good. Then we get the emergence of the first cellular life. We get all of this, all of the creatures of the sea and the beginning of these tiny organisms of a very early period. And then we get some of the emergence out onto the land some 600 million years ago. And God says, that's good. Then we pass on into the reptilian age, and God says that's good. Then we get 100 million years ago, we get the flowering plants. And God says that's good. And so, on up to the present. And then he comes to the humans. And God has to stop and think. He says, the humans are the most recent and the most critical issue in the whole process. And God can't yet say that's good. In terms of the ultimate process, and that is where we are. We are at the place in the creative order where our role is to enable God to say, that's good, and then to say, it's very good. But when we are living in this emergent process, this is a new way of dealing with the emergent process, whereas if you have in spatially considered stories or modes of consciousness, the sequence is there. It's an unbreakable pattern of reality, and it's simultaneous. One of the important things about the emergent universe is that everything is genetically related to everything else. All life forms are cousins to every other life form, because the cell, whether it's in an insect or whether it's in the leaf of a tree or whether it's in a bird's wing or in the human brain, all cells are so close, so identical in their composition that they had to emerge out of a common origin. And so that what we have is a universe that is genetically related, and that's such an exciting thing. Christians had such a great difficulty in accepting the rest of the universe. It's just amazing how much difficulty Christians have had in accepting their relationship with other living beings. It's one of the greatest difficulties that we have faced. Brian, do you have any observations on that particular point?
Yeah. You want to read it? You want to read number 2?
Yeah. You read it. You read it.
Okay. The universe is a unity and interacting and genetically related community of beings bound together in an inseparable relationship in space and time. And the unity of the planet Earth is especially clear. Each being of the planet is profoundly implicated in the existence and function of every other being on the planet. I want to say a few words about that. I think it's very important to get a feel for the way in which the planet is a unity. I know when I didn't think of the planet as a unity when I was growing up. I drew pictures of it a lot. It was like this. I had, there was the planet, and then here I was, my friends were here. I always do this. And the great mystery in my life were the Chinese, like that, you know. So basically there was the planet, and then there were these beings. I might even draw a tree on the planet. But that's a child's conception within a mechanistic worldview. And now I realize that it's not that way at all. What's actually happening, there's no boundary, first of all. There's no boundary. It's, or at least the boundary itself is only temporal. It's all part of a temporal flux. So we have, the Earth itself is all in motion. So you have particles coming from the core out to the crust. There's great motion here. And then this would be the physical structure, perhaps. Or then we have the atmosphere. The atmosphere, too, is in enormous motion, always moving. In fact, the atmosphere hooks in to the planet as a whole. So here comes some oxygen. You breathe it in. It gets evolved in here for about 500 million years. And it comes out over here. You see, so the whole thing's in flux. And as well, we have a sun. See how I drew it again, like the old planet. The sun too is a boiling of gases and light. And this is all this is connected up with the planet itself. But this would be the physical structure of the planet, and then the life forms themselves are like small tornadoes. They suck up all this material and energy, and for a time of twisting and organization. And the whole thing then is involved. That'd be my way of drawing the picture now if I were 5. I think that would, if I were an artist, I'd do a heck of a lot better job now. That would be the physical way of seeing the interconnectivity. Another way would be through the genetic interrelationship. See, all of the genes that we have in our body were created by organisms billions of years ago. The actual units of the genes themselves, they've been recombined in a new way. They've been provided by the previous organisms. They have, but also passed down are the genetic codes. So our own emotional responses are tied into genetic programs that are handed down. This was given remarkable elucidation in the 30s when they took these finches from South America. The finches had not, now a finch, if it sees a shadow of a large bird on the ground, will leap into a fright and start shrieking, you see? So it's the shadow itself evokes this kind of response from the finch. I'm trying to say that this finch then is connected with all of the past, you see? Now, these finches had not been around any predator birds for millions of years. They brought them up to America, sent them back across America, and as soon as the finches saw the shadow of the hawk on the ground, immediately started shrieking. You see, so like this kind of interconnectivity over space and time gathers it all together.
One of the things I'd like to mention here as regards the things that we are developing in what might be called this version of the story is that peoples have known this for a long time. In a certain sense, this is not entirely new. The sense of intimacy with the natural world is something that was known in a different way. It's not necessary to say that we know more than others knew. What is important, we know differently. And it is that difference in our knowing that is important. Now, other peoples, earlier peoples in what we would designate as Neolithic or post-Neolithic, even Paleolithic, have known this communion of life. It's not that we are discovering something so totally new, and that again is one of the confirmatory aspects of the authenticity of the story as we are able to develop it now, is that it does have a resonance with, and stories reconfirm each other. And in this way, it is both an invention and a recovery. of earlier experiences of the human. So that is the third, that's the second principle that of this emergent universe that we need to be aware of, the unity. First, the universe is revelatory of ultimate mystery. The second thing, that it is a unity, and as a unity, we could say it is community. And this, I'll show you later how this relates to the doctrine of the Trinity. Because the universe is an unbreakable community. It's total community. Everything is immediately in contact with everything else in the universe, and the bond is unbreakable. The third principle that we need to be rather much aware of is that from the beginning, the universe is a psychic, spiritual, as well as a physical reality. The reason for this is the unity of the universe that must be preserved. We reveal the universe in one of its deepest dimensions, that is of consciousness. It's the idea that humans are somehow put into a background created by the universe, which is sometimes the impression given by Genesis, is not quite adequate. We must think ourselves as integral with the universe, and scientifically, at the present time, there's increasing awareness that the universe is a psychic as well as a physically emergent reality. Now, it has taken a period of time to realize this, but the basic idea that has to be developed here is that the element carbon, say, which is the basis on which organic life is developed together with a few other elements, a person who understands carbon in its physical status purely doesn't know carbon. It doesn't know the capacity of the carbon if it don't know life. It's an abstract thing. It's an abstraction. There is no world of carbon that is in actual existence that is not also a world of life, that is manifests the deepest capacities of that, or also a world of consciousness. Carbon thinks. It's kind of interesting, I think. There's that capacity. We activate capacities in this. Now, rather than saying that this is a dragging down of the human to the mechanical, it's not that at all. It's activating the deep dimensions of the universe. We couldn't think if there weren't carbon. We couldn't exist. Nothing could exist. And that is reveals capacities of the elements. And the capacity of the planet Earth. It's not simply that carbon is carbon. Carbon is one of the most significant aspects of the entire planet Earth, or of the universe. When a person tells the story of an evolving universe, we are not telling a story of random matter. We are studying the activation of a process, and this activation of a process fulfills what might be considered to be one of the most important aspects of the creativity itself, because creativity on the part of divine reality, thinking in terms of a creative personal deity, the basic idea that has always been presented is on the principle that the divine wishes to communicate itself as fully as possible to a phenomenal, to a world of creation. But it wishes to communicate the greatest possible powers to that, not simply to create a kind of a mannequin that would be moved by extrinsic forces or manipulated somehow. That's the purpose of the divine, is to create self-acting reality. And so the divine enabled the universe to create itself. It's a tremendous thing. Teilhard uses that phrase very often. He calls it a self-arranging universe. So that this is one of the basic principles of goodness. A person wishes to communicate to the other the greatest possible capacity of sharing in a person's own existence. And so that is why when we say the universe is in a certain sense divine, that's the purpose of the whole thing, the divine wishing to share itself. And it shares itself in a most magnificent way by enabling the universe to create itself. Now, it's a much more fascinating idea of creation than to figure that God made this and put it there, and God made that, and God made something else, and ended up with a well-arranged universe. That's not at all as fascinating as this sense of a universe that emerged into being and then exploded in all different directions and formed galaxies and went through supernova explosion and swirling stardust, and then gradually articulated itself in solar systems, and then into this garden planet of the universe, the Earth. And at the present time, we don't know of any other planet, and there may be other planets. Some scientists would say that, like Carl Sagan apparently believes, that it's almost certain that intelligence like ours exists in other planets. It's possible. Or somebody like Sir Bernard Lovell would say that the chances are 1 to raised to or 10 to the millionth power. That is, that it's not at all likely or almost totally impossible. So that there's, but what we do know is that within our range, present range of knowledge, is that that we articulate a dimension of the universe in a very special way. That this planet is special. Now, going on to the next. The three basic laws of the universe at all levels of reality are differentiation, subjectivity, and communion. This is, I think, one of the most important aspects of this sequence. Difference, articulating difference, by definition, the universe is differentiated. Were no differentiation, it wouldn't be any universe. And it's differentiated not simply by spatial extension of homogeneous smudge, but by articulated entities. What they would call granulation, or we could call it by atomization, or this establishing of individuated centers. It's like creating centered universes in themselves. Almost every articulation, even an atom, is a kind of a universe in itself. It is the differentiation. So, and the person has the absolute value of the individual, of the particle. Each particle is an absolute and unrepeatable in the whole sequence of things. No single articulation can ever be repeated. It's absolutely unique. Each individual person is absolutely unique, and unless each individual person or each individual particle fulfills its role, there will always be something lacking to the universe. It's that important, the articulation of the individual. So we have first the fact that of difference from each other, and then inner articulation, the subjectivity that each has is an expression of ultimate mystery in a unique and unrepeatable way. And then we have the bonding. The universe is bonded together in an absolute and unbreakable community. It validates the absolute reality of the particular, because each articulation of reality is given in uniqueness. each person, for instance, is totally unique, that there never was and never will be anyone quite like an individual person. And it's one of the difficulties that we have of our individuality, is that we have no models. There's no model for me. There's no model for you. There's no model, so that we are looking around and we don't like to have to identify who we are to that extent. We like to say, well, there's somebody here, give me some idea who I am. And we can get some idea, but it's why Paul Tillich wrote that work of his called The Courage to Be, because it takes an awful lot of courage to articulate that mode of being, that particularity, and to articulate it in some depth with the fullness and security and the vitality that each individual should have is something that requires understanding. It requires a certain amount of courage. It also has a certain amount of pain involved in it, because it involves misunderstanding and so forth. But we have to articulate our identity, our distinction from others, and also develop our interior qualities, that is, our subjectivity. Because by articulating our subjective mystery of our being, then we are able to express the depth of the reality that we are, and it passes all the way to the whole structure of the evolutionary process. For instance, my hand is, how old is it? Well, I might say it's 14 billion years old, or perhaps some would say the universe is 18, 20 billion years old. Well, my hand is as old as the universe. It's taken that long to make this hand, and this hand would not be this hand except it took that long to make. Might be another hand, but and everything that's happened in the universe has affected the structure of this hand. It's present there. The atoms that are there were made in the supernova explosions of some billions of light years ago. So that the great mystery of the infinity of the universe and the galactic system is present there. And everything that has happened on Earth, and the whole sequence of the shaping of life in the sea, the early cellular life, the land development, the whole the whole Paleozoic era from, say, 600 million years ago to 225 million years ago. That is all there, those life forms. Then the great dinosaur age, the great reptilian age, from 225 million years ago to 65 million years ago. All the events that took place there are involved in the shaping of that hand. And then the mammalian age that comes in 65 million years ago has developed until humans developed. Now, we humans are just so recent. We are just so recent, it's just amazing. It's a shocking thing. Once a person begins to think in terms of billions of light years of space, and these billions of years of time, it's a shock to think that the animals, say the ginkgo tree, I saw a ginkgo tree down the road today. The ginkgo tree has been around 130 million years. 130 million years. Crocodiles have been around. Yeah, there's the ginkgo leaf.
Same leaf.
Yeah, and you find precisely that impression in veins of coal and in the impress of rocks that long ago. It's an old form of life. The flowers that exist at the present time, flowering plants, are something like 100 million years old when they came into being. So that in our sense of time, sometimes I ask people, what day is it? Or what year is it? And they say, such a day, year, what is it, 1984, I believe. This year. What does that mean? Well, for the coming of Christ, we really could benefit by beginning to think differently. And if I ask somebody, what year is it? Well, say it's the 65 millionth year of the mammalian period. It's the 50th year of 60 or 80 some or 90 some years of the automobile age, or it's the of the galaxy. Maybe go back to 15 billion years of the Earth itself. It's the 4,600,000,000th year there. When we talk 4,600,000,000 years, and you can take a rock where I am. I go out every day and I take a few steps, and there's the rock structure there, the 300 million years there. The mica schist, out of which the Bronx Ridge along the Hudson is formed. And I have to think, 300 million years. That's a long time. And me, I'm just around, or humans, around, as we are now, we're probably less than 100,000 years old. Hominoid types, maybe 3 million. But human types, as we are now, we are probably less than 100,000 years of humans as we are now. The other races died out. So this, as regards ourselves, there is that problem of things that have happened, and things that have happened, say at the Neolithic, was the first time that agriculture, how old is agriculture? We are asking, what year is it? Well, say the 10 or 12,000th year of the agricultural time. That is the cultivation of land, of settled villages, maybe 10, 12,000 years. And then we come to more recent America, just a few hundred years and so forth. It's very important for us to begin to think this, but not to think exactly that humans are such recent things. We are both ancient and recent. And in that sense, the universe has sought reflection on itself in human consciousness for these 15 billion years. So in that sense, we are an urgency of the universe. We are an urgency of the planet Earth over all this period of time, and we should feel our identity with that whole period of time and feel the excitement of having this. And it's one of the important things in Jungian archetypal symbolism. Jung had problems with whether or not the archetypal symbols were handed on through genetic coding, or were biologically communicated, or whether these archetypal mythic forms or energies were somehow culturally derived. And it's rather clear. In some places, he indicates that it comes with our humanness itself. And I would explain it by the fact that these great archetypal structures and tendencies of the deepest part of our unconscious are the remains or the impress of our former modes of existence. That we have within us all these archetypal experiences that the universe has gone through. And these archetypal experiences are not only in our physical being and our biological being, but in our mind being, that our mind began to be formed from the beginning of the universe. So that once we begin to get this type of a sense of our story, then we begin to see that in our articulating our individual being, we are not just a type of ephemeral being, as we find in some scientific studies or scientific treatises indicating that the more we learn about the universe, the less significant humans become. It's just the opposite. The more we learn about the universe, the more we know about ourselves, the more terribly important the human is, particularly at the present time, where we live on the garden planet of the universe, and the destinies of the planet are in our hands. So, as we articulate our own particular being in its deep inner structures, we are articulating the total universal process. But it's not only a temporal process, but also spatially extended. That is, we are in communion, direct communion, with every other being in the universe. Every atom of the universe is directly influencing every other atom of the universe, or every particle of matter is immediately influencing every other particle, although it may be some billions of light years away. There is an immediacy of everything with everything else, and so that there is this bonding of everything. So when I say that these are the three values, the three basic values: the differentiation, the inner articulation, and the bonding with everything else. These are the three basic references that we have, or the three basic elements of what I would call the new natural law. The natural law theories of former times, where we had the eternal essences in a universe that was a fixed universe, where everything was put there as it is and was always eternally there. We are in a different world now, because the basic value of each thing would be being true to its own nature. Because the consideration was that every nature was fixed in its identity, and in being true to its own nature, it was fulfilling its highest value. But when you have a universe, an emergent reality, where things are emerging into being, there is not that type of fixed frame of reference. And so the basic value is in what enables the creative process to continue its expression in and through its human mode. And it's found in perfecting the articulation of our being individually, as in our difference, in the inner mystery of our being, and in our communion with the total community of life, the total community of Earth, the total community of the universe. And in this total community of the universe, there is the fulfillment of things, as I mentioned, out of St. Thomas. This is taken from the Summa Theologica. I've mentioned it before. It's Part 1, Question 47, Article 1. I didn't bring copies today, but I'll bring copies tomorrow and give copies to those that are here. He said the question he's trying to answer is whether the difference and multitude of things and distinction of things is from God. The argument, the objection is that this must come from some other reality, like pre-existent matter or something like that. But everything produces one thing. That is, robins produce robins, and oak trees produce oak trees, so God should produce God. Well, he argues, St. Thomas says that it doesn't quite work that way with God, because he cannot create any single being that would equate with his own being, but he can create the great complex of beings in which the mystery of his own being is shared with other beings and reflected back to himself in the celebration of existence. So he says, we must say that the distinction and multitude of things comes from the first agent, who is God. For he brought things into being in order that his goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. And because his goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, he produced many and diverse creatures. that what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. For goodness, which in God is simple and uniform, in creatures is manifold and divided, and hence the whole universe together participates the divine goodness more perfectly and represents it better than any single creature whatever. Now this is the basis, I think, for saying that St. Thomas has a cosmocentric, geocentric, or biocentric approach to the universe rather than a homocentric approach. In other words, the total life community, the total earth community, the total universe community, in its well-being is what represents the divine goodness. Now this is very important, because if a person were to say what's wrong with the present and what is the primary element in reinventing the human, the difference is between the homocentrism of the present and the biocentrism that we're asking for. The human must be reinvented in its biocentric, geocentric, and cosmocentric role. And so far, it's very far from us. That's why we become environmentalists. And environmentalism is not any adequate program, because environmentalism looks at the rest of the world as environment for humans, where that's not any decent approach to the earth community. The proper approach is to place the center in the community and look upon ourselves as members of the community. But the community is what most reflects the divine reality, not the human, the community. So that when we use the community for human benefit, rather than seeing that humans benefit the community, we've distorted the whole process. And that's the difficulty with environmentalism. And it's why the ecological approach is radically different from the environmental approach. Although, at the present time, people cannot even conceive of the ecological approach. They wouldn't understand what you're talking about. They hardly understand a decent attitude toward the environment for human welfare. So to take this step is a difficult step, but the religious people should be able to do it, and I have serious complaints against the religious community for their inability to articulate this very simple theological principle. And it's why the papal social encyclicals are theologically inadequate. Because the papal social encyclicals talk about justice of humans and participation of humans in the benefits of the earth, but it does not talk about the real community of humans with the earth community. And there is no justice and there's no hope for the poor of the earth except in a new approach to the planet itself. Until we have peace with the earth, we're not going to have peace among humans, and we're not going to have a world of plenty until we enable the earth to produce, to flourish in its richness. But we have so ruined the earth that our social programs, our sense of society is distorted. In the first place, it's an abstraction. So that when the popes write these wonderful social encyclicals about human social thing, they're writing about an abstraction. You say, well, these humans, they're not an abstraction, they're real beings there, but they are beings that have no existence except in this community. And if you ignore this life community, this earth community, and simply talk about humans as though they were something in themselves apart from this community, you're talking about an abstraction. There's no human society in itself. There's only the community of the earth. So, going to this element, the three basic laws of the universe are differentiation, subjectivity, and communion. This is the way in which I would establish the basic values that we need to develop. Now, I would like to go on to this next item, the human is that being in whom the universe attains reflexive consciousness of itself. The human is more a mode of being of the planet than a separate being on the planet. Now that's sometimes difficult for people to grasp, but it's extremely important truth to grasp, because we need to get this idea of the total process. And it's why our theologians, I think, are terribly deficient in this fact of not bringing out that the unit of creation, the unit of salvation, and the unit of beatification have to be the same. In other words, we are not saved unless the universe is saved. To talk about saving humans, that's, we don't have anything. How do we up there, if we don't have the rest of these things, talk about being resurrected bodily, it doesn't have any meaning if the universe is not resurrected. I don't have any meaning without the rest of the life community. The unit has to be identified. The unit of creation, the unit of salvation, and the unit of ultimate beatification must identify. Now, how can this quotation of St. Thomas be verified if that's not true? Where he says that the basic intention of the diversity is that the whole together is what mirrors the divine perfection. And that is the difficulty of this partial election in a biblical sense and partial covenant. It has to be a covenant with the total community. So once we get that, it's just so marvelous sense, I think, so liberating and so and it's a celebratory thing. It's not merely that the universe reflects on itself in us, but it celebrates itself. It's a celebratory thing. The planet, it's celebration. The great supernova explosions, our fireworks are nothing compared to that. But so creative. And then the planet Earth, this spinning off of this sawdust into this remarkable solar system, the great sun, which the great star, our star, which is the sun, which carries over 99% of the mass of the solar system, is in the sun. So big that it burns 4 million tons of hydrogen a second. It can go on doing this for such a long period for another 10 billion years. And then there are these little planets around, and there's the Earth. You know, such a stupendous thing. And then by having the moon there just so far from the Earth that enables the tides to rock back and forth. If the moon were not there in that precise place, then if it were further away, the seas would be stagnant. There would be no life. If it were closer to the Earth, the tides would sweep over the continents. So it has to be just right. It's celebration. All of this is remarkable celebration of the flowering planet. And the great volcanoes are the pressures of the planet that created the inner fires of the Earth and caused the gases to collect and then to explode in volcanic activity to create the air and the water and so forth. And then to have a crust of the Earth where broken off into 6, 8 or more segments themselves floating back and forth, crashing into each other and moving apart from each other and so forth. It's a stupendous thing. And then throwing the birds into the air and the fish into the sea and so forth. All of this is just so miraculous. When a person studies the insects, and there is that beautiful book written, The Strange Lives of Familiar Insects, that's one of the most exciting books a person could read. Well, all of this is simply so much celebration. And once we get that feel of it, a person sees why the early peoples and the early tribal peoples celebrated so much, danced so much, and had such a song and instituted cycles of liturgies. And our liturgies are simply ways of celebrating and of corresponding to the dynamics of the natural world. The question of the human, as that being in whom the universe reflects on itself, is a rather remarkable way. And you know who identified this first? It wasn't Westerners with all our genius. It wasn't even the great people in India. It was the Chinese. The Chinese were the first person really to see clearly 3,000 years ago. It's why, in my estimation, in our work of reinventing the human, the greatest help comes from the Chinese tradition, from the Confucian and Taoist traditions of China. India is too much transcendent-oriented. The Greeks were too rationally oriented. The biblical people were fighting with God too much. And only the Chinese really understood the way of entering into the numinous experience through the rhythms of the planet Earth. And that's when they developed, around 3,000 years ago, this idea of the human is the Shin of the universe, and Shin is a character, Chinese character, it's a picture of the human heart, but it would have to be translated generally as the consciousness of the universe, or as the heart of the universe. And you have it there, just the picture of a heart. It's the heart of the universe. And it's just so much better than looking at the human in the Western way. The human is a rational animal, Aristotle's definition, and the general Western definition, and composed of this and that and so forth. But at this stage, this has been recovered by Teilhard de Chardin. It's one of his great accomplishments within a Christian context to recover this sense of the universe giving expression to itself in the human, and the role of the human having that possibility. There is the next that I would like to deal with is the Earth, and this is, again, a very special section, this section 6. The Earth within the solar system has 6 qualities now. Is self-emergent, self-nourishing, self-educating, self-governing, self-healing, and self-fulfilling community. The primary role of the individual is to articulate itself within community. It has to articulate difference because it's no value to the community if it's the same as anything else in the community. The idea of sameness, we have to articulate difference, but in relationship. It's what I call intimacy and distance. You're no good to anybody. You can't be intimate unless you're different. That's why men and women can be so profoundly intimate, is because they're so profoundly different. And the difference should be intensified by the intimacy, and the difference should increase the intimacy. So there is that dialectical relationship. So it's self-emergent. Now this is most important in the design of the divine, because the divine wishes to communicate itself, not to have a mannequin out there, to have something there that functions out of its own principle, because it's no good to just to create something and that doesn't have its own spontaneities. And that's why the universe is self-creating. We don't like that idea because we think, well, that takes it away from the divine control. It doesn't mean that it takes it away from the divine numinous presence. St. Thomas says, which is clear, that God functions in everything that functions. Deus operator and omnia operant is the Latin expression of it. He says that in his Summa Theologica, that the numinous mystery of the universe pervades the universe and its every reality. But St. Thomas spent his whole lifetime trying to say that the principle of action is in the phenomenal world, and it's not simply in the divine world. Before the time of St. Thomas, there was the idea that ultimately the truth of things was in the divine world, not in the phenomenal world. St. Thomas, his great work was to validate what's called the secondary causality, or the phenomenal world in its activity. And so to say self-creative is a valid thing to say. That's why when I come to the human, I'll show you how the human, more than any other part of the universe, articulates its own existence. So it's self-emergent. I sometimes use the word self-propagating, but self-emergent and self-propagating, self-nourishing. The universe is rich in the way in which it's nourished, in which beings nourish each other. It's here, if you have the first, you have a biological, the propagation aspect of the Earth community. We have the what might be called the economic aspect, the nourishing aspect of the planet Earth. It's self-educating, self-governing, self-healing. It's why the planet is itself our primary healer. It's self-fulfilling community. Now, all particular life systems in their being, their nourishment, their education, their governing, their healing, their fulfillment must integrate their functioning within this larger complex of mutually dependent Earth systems. That's why I say the planet Earth is the first school, it's the first healer, it's the first economic venture, it's the first in everything, it's the first lawgiver, it's the first governor, it's the first in everything. So that, and it is our obligation when we articulate this in a conscious mode, it's a further extension of this, but the reality is in the community itself, in its nourishing process, and that's the difficulty. Say the corporation. Sometimes I've spoken to corporation people that or can get concerned over their relation of corporation and commercial life to the society or to the environment and so forth. And I just tell them, how do you think you can succeed if the great corporation goes bankrupt? You are a part of the great Earth Corporation. And this great Earth Corporation is not self-exhausting, but self-enriching. Why don't you learn from the Earth process how to run a corporation? Then I go to the educators, and I go to the universities, and I say, the great educator is the Earth. And I said, the great college, so why don't you pattern your education around putting the student in contact with the great university, which is the planet Earth. Same with healing. How do we heal anybody? You put them in contact with the air and the water and the soil and the sunlight and the living forms of the planet Earth. And that's the first step of any healer. And it's why our medical practice has so little to do with health. It has a lot to do with disease, but very little to do with health. because this very simple truth is set aside. And so we could go to religion. The earth is the first presentation of the divine. It's the locus of meeting of the human and the divine. So why do we run off to books or to Bibles or this and that when the great Bible is right there in front of us? It's the first Bible. It is the first scripture. So whether it's revelation of the divine, whether it's education, whether it's medicine, whether it's law and governance, whether it's commerce, whether it's technology. Earth has technologies that we don't dream of doing, of getting to. So all of this is there for us. Now, when I talk about reinventing the human, I'm talking about reinventing in this context of enabling us to re-establish our position in the earth community and letting the earth community educate us, letting it reveal to us the divine, and letting it give us a governance, a community governance. The next we come to the processes by which the earth functions. How does the earth do this? Through coding and through the great mystery of genetic coding. This is a very important aspect of the universe, what might be called the coding of the universe. Now, there is a coding of codings that we're only beginning to understand. That is, and the greatest mystery of all, is how the coding of this great variety of insects, the coding of the trees, the coding of the flowers, and the coding of even the physical world, the coding of the elements, how all these interact so beautifully together as to create a bio-spiritual planet. And we have to, that's a good name for the planet, a bio-spiritual planet. It's so intimate in its total composition that somebody like Lewis Thomas would say that the best analogy he can find for the earth is a single cell. Everything is so intimate with everything else. Or also, he again says that to a biologist looking at the planet Earth from a distance over a long period of time, it looks like an embryogenesis. And he also used the expression that I have been using, that the human is creating the great mind of the planet. And so modern biology is now able to say these wonderful things about the universe. When it comes to coding, it's such a remarkable thing. The genetic coding is the process through which the world of the living evolves, educates, and rules itself. The great wonder is the creative interaction of the multiple codings among themselves. There are very few species that have extensive cultural coding in the pre-human world. A fair number of birds and animals have to be taught after they are born. Now, there's some things like take the certain butterflies that migrate. The parents migrate maybe several thousand miles. There's one group of monarch butterflies that migrate several thousand miles, say from California. And then the young are born up there. They're genetically coded. They never were down in California. They know where to go in California. It's astounding. Now, how do they know how to go to California? But it's one of those remarkable things that, and there are just so many miracles that are performed that way that are just absolutely astounding. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. except to note it, but I want to come to the human level. At the human level, genetic coding mandates a further transgenetic cultural coding by which specific human qualities find expression. Cultural coding is carried on by educational processes. What this means is that humans create themselves more extensively than any other species, because we are genetically coded to a further transgenetic cultural coding. Now, what does that mean? That means, for instance, that we are genetically coded to speak, but how we speak is cultural coding. We're genetically coded to live in society. How we structure our society is cultural coding. So that we need a whole long period of development, 14, 15, 18, 20 years, before we become humanized in a complete way. And the reason is that the development of consciousness takes a period of time, and it's what differentiates us from some of the animals that are somewhat close to humans at an earlier stage, but they are fixated too early. But the humans have a long period of self-development that they go through. And this self-development is what might be considered that self-creation of the human, so that we invent ourselves in that way much more extensively than any other species. Now, what I'm talking about is that we have invented ourselves within the various cultural contexts of the past. We've invented ourselves in tribal context. We've invented ourselves in the Hindu and the Buddhist context, in the Chinese context, in the Greek and the Persian context, in the biblical context, in the context of the Middle Ages, in the context of the modern world. Now, this self-creation has articulated itself in many wonderful ways. But we are at the present time in a situation, and we're facing problems that none of these can deal with adequately, because we have, out of our Western cultural coding, we have emerged into new types of human understanding and human controls over the universe, and we have gradually drifted into deleterious modes of functioning that have given us, that have endangered the planet itself. And we become a non-viable species because the learning that we have has a twofold value. It's a two-edged sword, so to speak, or it has a basic double aspect. It has given us this story of the universe, which is so stupendous. At the same time, it has given us power to escape basic biological processes and limitations that generally the natural world imposes on the different forms of life. And now that we are at a point of change, we have to bring about what might be considered the most extensive change that has ever taken place in human affairs. And if there were a parliament of creatures at the present time of the planet Earth, they would vote us out immediately. And it'd be difficult to find species that are not worse off since humans have been around. It's a rather unsatisfying way to think of ourselves. But it's the simple reality, and it's so obvious. that we are not, at this stage, we are not desirable beings. Now the question is, how do we become desirable? How do we become effective? Or how do we become a creative member of the life community of the planet Earth? So what I'm proposing in these principles is exactly that we move toward the geocentric and biocentric mode of consciousness and of value, and reorient our lives accordingly. So that is the important aspect of this cultural coding, which is carried on by educational processes. I have done a piece, it was published in Teachers College Record a couple of years ago on the American College, where I outlined the basic core course that should govern every college, and the manner in which this could be carried out. And it would be based on the principle that education is simply learning the story. But learning the story in a significant way. There are people and there are sciences and courses where people learn something of the story of the universe, the story of Earth, but not in its significance in the way in which we're trying to present it here. But this should be the basis of all education, whether secular education, religious education, or professional education. Just think what this would mean professionally. Because this is, by all odds, the story of the universe is the beginning of medical profession. The commercial profession, business courses, should be rooted in the story of the planet Earth and how humans interact commercially with the planet Earth, because the planet Earth is a commercial venture. Just like it's a health venture, it's a legal venture, and the law schools should begin with the governance of the Earth and how this governance in the community of the Earth is participated in by humans. So all the professions, all of our activities have to be governed this way, and education, any sound education must take place in this context. So that is where we are at the present in terms of our cultural development. That is, at the human level, the cultural coding is carried out by the educational processes. So, now 9. The emergent process of the universe is irreversible and non-repeatable in the existing world order. The movement from non-life to life on the planet Earth is a one-time event. So too, the movement from life to the human form of consciousness, the movement from the simpler to the more complex cultural forms, is also most likely irreversible in the larger time scale. One of the important things about the sense of irreversibility, this has to do with uniqueness, not only uniqueness in otherness in terms of present existing otherness, but otherness in the time sequence. That historical events are irreversible. And at the present time, what we are doing has irreversible consequences. Now, there are some things that can, to some extent, be remedied, but there is an irreversibility about the basic things. Never again will there be a movement from the non-living to the living. Those conditions were eliminated. When that happened, the new forms of life, when the early forms of life came into being, they consumed the conditions in which they came into being. And life would have died out except for the invention, a new invention that took place in the form of photosynthesis. which didn't exist in the earlier forms of life, and that's what enabled life to continue. But life could not come into being first through photosynthesis. It had to first go through the sequence of the creation of the amino acids and the articulation of the early virus forms and then the cellular form and so forth. But in a certain sense, everything is abiding. Now, to say irreversible doesn't mean that things are lost. Things abide. The tribal forms and their discovery, they abide. They're still with us. Without our knowledge of them, we cannot manage the human situation. The great civilizations give us knowledge that we can't live without. I don't mean that we can do these things without the guidance of the past. In fact, there's an urgency to know the past and its trajectory in order to deal with the future. And it's why I say the tribal peoples of the world at present time are so precious. If we don't take care of the tribal groups, the marginal tribal minorities, we are just going to lose enormously in the resources available for us to deal with the things that we have to deal with. That's first, and also with the great cultural traditions. As you see, we need these insights that they provide for us. Also, they will, for the indefinite future and forever, will provide the great volume of what it is to be human. Now, the next has to do with the historical sequence of cultural periods, which we have mentioned before, can be identified as the tribal shamanic period, the classical civilizational period of the great religious culture, the scientific technological period, and the ecological period. We've already mentioned that very extensively, so I don't think that we need to comment very extensively on that. Now, 11. The main human task of the immediate future is to assist in activating the intercommunion of all the living and non-living components of the Earth community in what can be considered the emerging ecological period of Earth development. And that's the way in which I would identify where we are and what we should be doing. Now, there's a large number of people that are doing this. It's not being done from any central point of direction, but there are hundreds and hundreds of independent organizations that are into this. Now, this group that's here is the only theologically oriented group or religious oriented group within a general Catholic Christian type auspices that is trying to identify this new activity within an overall Christian perspective, and particularly with the emphasis moving from redemption preoccupations to creation concerns, which is perhaps the most important thing to do religiously. We need to move scripturally from written scriptures to the scripture of the natural world. We need to move from redemption concerns to creation concerns. We need to move from our homocentrism to a biocentrism. If we do these things, we can begin to cultivate a way of managing the future and contributing at least the religious dimension to this. And this is most important because all of these movements that are doing a lot, people like Wes Jackson, people like John and Nancy Todd, people like Hazel Henderson, who's doing so much with the economics, people like the Chinook organization, and just people like Peter Berg, and then our venture into the bioregional functioning of the lower Hudson Basin and so forth, Jacques Cousteau's movement, the Wilderness Society, and just endless listing of things, the Friends of the Earth, the Sierra Group. All of these are doing some tremendous things along these lines, be like Murray Bookchin with the social ecology. So this has become a pervasive movement. And I think that if this gets into the religious perspective in a vital way, there are fantastic associations that can be made and an element added to the existing work that's done that presently sometimes tends not to be present so clearly. But one of the things that I would like to mention too at this point is the document of the United Nations. I've never seen reference to this document in our communications media. Strangely to say, I sometimes suggest that this may be at least one of the most important documents of my lifetime. If it had been passed in its earlier version, I would say that it's the most important document of my lifetime. It's just weakened a bit in its final version. It was passed by United Nations in October of 1982. It's called the World Charter for Nature. And it's the first time that humans, through their human establishment, has produced such a document. So this human task of the immediate future is to assist in activating this capacity for presence. Now, the last statement here has to do with functionally the great art of achieving this historical goal is the art of intimacy and distance. The capacity of beings to be totally present to each other while further affirming and enhancing the differences and identities of each. So that it's ultimately a question of the capacity for community, and that this is where our future lies. And it's what is involved when I propose that what we need is to reinvent the human.